The person who loves you the most may be the same person who is terrified to admit it. There is a strange contradiction buried inside the mind of an avoidant, one that almost nobody understands, not even the avoidant themselves. They do not run from you because you are unworthy. They run because somewhere inside their nervous system you feel dangerous. Not dangerous in the way a threat feels dangerous, but dangerous in the way importance feels dangerous to a person who was never taught how to hold it safely. This is the part nobody talks about. Avoidants do not distance themselves from people who mean nothing. They distance themselves from the ones who mean everything. And underneath that distance is something rarely spoken aloud, something almost embarrassing in its honesty. They think you are special. They believe it quietly, privately, and it terrifies them more than rejection ever could. What you are about to hear will change the way you see distance, fear, and love itself. Fear and love are not opposites inside the human mind. This is the first truth almost nobody understands about the avoidant. Society teaches people that love and fear sit on opposite ends of a spectrum, that one pushes the other away. But inside the nervous system of a person who learned early in life that closeness was unpredictable, fear and love become fused together into a single sensation. When an avoidant feels deeply for someone, their body does not register safety, it registers exposure. The heart does not calm down when it finds something precious. It speeds up because precious things can be lost, and loss was never something this person learned how to survive gracefully. Consider the strange behavior of a person who withdraws precisely when things are going well. Most people interpret this as sabotage, as if the avoidant is deliberately destroying something good, but sabotage implies conscious intention, and what is actually happening is something far more automatic. The nervous system of an avoidant was shaped, often in early childhood, to associate emotional intensity with danger. A parent who was inconsistent, a caregiver who was emotionally unavailable, a household where affection came with conditions attached. These experiences do not simply fade with time, they become blueprints, and blueprints do not ask permission before activating. When closeness deepens, the blueprint fires, and withdrawal becomes the body's attempt at self-protection, not an attack against the other person. Here is where the conversation must go deeper than most people are willing to take it. The avoidant does not actually fear the other person. They fear their own capacity to be destroyed by attachment. This distinction changes everything. It is not you they are avoiding. It is the version of themselves that becomes vulnerable in your presence. Underneath the cold exterior, underneath the emotional unavailability, there is often a person terrified of their own depth. They sense how much they could feel if they allowed themselves to feel it fully, and that sensing alone is enough to trigger retreat. Now, something must be said about the other side of this equation, because attachment psychology often forgets that two nervous systems are dancing together, not one. The person who loves an avoidant, often labeled the anxious or the empath, is not merely an innocent bystander waiting patiently for affection. Their own psychology is deeply entangled in this dynamic, whether they realize it or not. Many people who find themselves drawn again and again to emotionally distant partners are unconsciously recreating a familiar emotional environment, one where love had to be earned, chased, or proven. Familiarity, not happiness, is often what the nervous system seeks. Pay close attention to this next observation because it rarely appears in mainstream relationship content. The empath does not merely tolerate emotional distance. In some cases, they are unconsciously drawn to it because distance creates a psychological puzzle to solve, and solving puzzles activates a sense of purpose. If someone grew up feeling that love had to be worked for, that affection was conditional on performance or emotional labor, then an emotionally available partner may feel foreign, even uninteresting, because there is no puzzle left to solve. Ease can feel suspicious to a nervous system trained on difficulty. This is the hidden cycle that most people never see clearly. The avoidant withdraws because closeness feels dangerous. The empath pursues because distance feels familiar and even purposeful. Both people are responding to old wiring, not to each other. Both are trapped inside patterns formed long before they ever met, patterns that have nothing to do with who the other person actually is. What looks like a romantic conflict is often two unresolved histories colliding in real time, each one interpreting the other through the lens of an old wound rather than present reality. Something must now be said about specialness, because this word carries enormous psychological weight. When an avoidant tells themselves consciously or unconsciously that someone is special, they are not merely expressing admiration. They are making a dangerous internal declaration. Specialness implies irreplaceability, and irreplaceability implies devastation if lost. The mind of a person who has built their identity around self-protection does not want to declare anything irreplaceable, because that declaration removes their exit strategy. To think of someone as replaceable is to remain safe. To think of someone as special is to hand over a piece of control that terrifies them. Reflect for a moment on how strange this truth actually is. The very fact that an avoidant creates distance may be proof that something real exists, not proof that nothing does. A person does not need psychological defenses against something meaningless. Defenses only activate when there is something worth defending against, or in this case, something worth defending the self from. This does not excuse harmful behavior, and it does not mean every distant partner secretly loves deeply. But it does mean that distance and depth are not always contradictions. Sometimes distance is the shadow that depth casts when it has nowhere safe to stand. There is a harsher truth hiding underneath all of this, one that deserves to be said plainly. Many people spend years waiting for an avoidant to change, believing that love alone will eventually dissolve the walls. This belief, however well-intentioned, often becomes a quiet form of self-abandonment. Waiting for someone else's psychological healing to determine your own worth is a transfer of power that rarely serves anyone. Healing is not something one person can perform on behalf of another through patience or sacrifice. It must be chosen consciously by the person carrying the wound. At this point, a deeper philosophical question must be asked, one that most relationship advice never dares to approach. What does it actually mean to be loved by someone who is afraid of loving you back? Is love that is filtered through fear still love, or is it something else entirely, a shadow of connection rather than connection itself? The answer is uncomfortable. Fear-filtered love is often real, but it is incomplete. It is love without full permission to exist, and loving something without permission is exhausting both for the person offering it and the person trying to receive it. Human beings often confuse intensity with intimacy, and this confusion sits at the very center of the avoidant and empath dynamic. Intensity is the emotional charge created by uncertainty, longing, and unresolved tension. Intimacy, by contrast, is the slow, steady, often unremarkable experience of being fully known and fully accepted over time. The relationship between an avoidant and an empath frequently produces enormous intensity, mistaken again and again for deep intimacy, when in truth intimacy may never have had the chance to develop, because safety, the very foundation intimacy requires, was never present long enough to take root. Consider now a paradox that rarely gets named directly. The avoidant often believes they are protecting the relationship by creating distance, when in reality they are protecting themselves from the relationship. This distinction sounds subtle, but it changes the entire moral framing of the situation. It is not that the avoidant values the connection less, it is that they value their own emotional survival more, and survival instincts, once activated, rarely consult logic or fairness. A person operating from a survival state is not making a calculated decision about love. They are making an automatic decision about safety, and safety will almost always override affection when the nervous system perceives threat. An overlooked truth about empaths deserves attention here, because it reveals something uncomfortable about the nature of giving. Many people who identify strongly as empaths were taught, often without words, that their value was tied to how much emotional labor they could provide. Giving became identity. Understanding became currency. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful trap. where the empath begins to seek out people who need to be understood, decoded, or emotionally rescued, because being needed in this specific way confirms their sense of worth. The avoidant, difficult to read and emotionally guarded, becomes an ideal canvas for this pattern, not because the empath enjoys suffering, but because complexity gives their gift of understanding somewhere meaningful to go. Now examine what happens when two incomplete stories meet. The avoidant carries an unspoken belief that closeness leads to loss of self. The empath carries an unspoken belief that worth must be earned through emotional effort. When these two belief systems collide, something predictable and tragic begins to form. The avoidant withdraws to protect their sense of self. The empath advances to prove their worth through effort. Each action confirms the other person's deepest fear. The avoidance withdrawal confirms the empath's belief that love must be chased. The empath's chasing confirms the avoidance belief that closeness inevitably becomes suffocating. Neither person created this cycle consciously, yet both are reinforcing it perfectly. A deeper layer must now be revealed, one that most conversations about attachment styles conveniently avoid. Avoidants are frequently mischaracterized as people who do not feel deeply. This characterization is almost always false. In many cases, avoidants feel with an intensity that overwhelms them internally, but they were never given a framework for processing that intensity in healthy ways. Emotion without a framework becomes chaos, and chaos left unmanaged gets converted into control. Distance, silence, and emotional withholding often function as makeshift regulation strategies, primitive tools used by a nervous system that never learned sophisticated ones. Here lies one of the most psychologically unsettling truths of this entire subject. Some avoidants unconsciously test the people they love, not through manipulation, but through withdrawal used as a form of unspoken inquiry. The withdrawal becomes a silent question. Will this person stay even when I offer nothing? Will their presence remain constant even when I remove all warmth? This is rarely a calculated strategy. It is closer to an involuntary experiment run by a wounded part of the psyche, desperately trying to determine whether love is conditional or unconditional based on evidence gathered from how the other person responds to absence. This raises an important and uncomfortable question about the role of the empath in this exchange. If someone continues to prove their loyalty by tolerating diminishing effort, they may be unintentionally teaching the avoidant that affection can be sustained without reciprocity. Patience, when offered without boundaries, can become a lesson in imbalance rather than an act of unconditional love. Real love does not require the erosion of self-respect as proof of its sincerity. A person can hold compassion for someone's wounds while still refusing to absorb the consequences of those wounds indefinitely. Something profound emerges when this dynamic is viewed through the lens of identity rather than romance alone. Every relationship becomes a mirror, reflecting back unresolved aspects of both individuals. The avoidant is forced to confront their fear of losing autonomy. The empath is forced to confront their fear of being unworthy without effort. Neither confrontation is comfortable, yet both are necessary for growth. Relationships that trigger old wounds are not accidents of incompatibility. They are often precise psychological encounters designed by life itself to expose exactly what still needs healing. A common misconception must be dismantled at this point because it quietly damages countless people who fall in love with avoidance. The belief that enough love, patience, or understanding will eventually unlock an avoidant's capacity for closeness is, in most cases, a fantasy built on hope rather than psychology. Healing cannot be outsourced. No amount of external devotion can substitute for the internal work a person must do to rewire their own relationship with vulnerability. Love can create the conditions for healing, but it cannot perform the healing itself. This distinction, though painful, protects people from years of unnecessary self-sacrifice. Silence in the context of an avoidant often carries more meaning than words ever could, yet it is consistently misinterpreted. Many people assume silence signals indifference, when in truth, silence frequently signals overwhelm. The avoidant mind, flooded with emotion it does not know how to articulate, often defaults to withdrawal simply because expression feels unsafe or unfamiliar. This does not mean silence should always be excused or endured. It means silence must be understood accurately before it can be responded to wisely, because responding to the wrong interpretation of a behavior almost always deepens the very cycle someone is trying to escape. At the center of this entire psychological landscape sits a single, quiet truth that deserves to be spoken with complete honesty. Both the avoidant and the empath are, in their own ways, terrified of the same thing, being truly known and still being left. The avoidant prevents this by never allowing themselves to be fully known. The empath prevents this by trying to become so valuable that leaving becomes impossible. Different strategies, same underlying fear. This is the hidden thread connecting two people who often believe they are nothing alike, when in truth they are mirror images of the same unresolved terror, wearing different masks to survive it. Notice how rarely anyone asks what an avoidant actually experiences in the moment right before they pull away. Most people only study the aftermath, the silence, the sudden coldness, the disappearance of warmth that once felt so certain. But the moment that matters most happens earlier, in a flash so brief it barely registers even to the avoidant themselves. It is the moment closeness crosses an invisible threshold, and the body interprets connection as confinement. This is not weakness. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, protecting a self that once learned, somewhere long ago, that being fully seen was not always followed by safety. A question worth sitting with is whether love can exist without permission from the one offering it. Many people assume love simply happens to them, an involuntary emotional event beyond their control. But love, in its mature form, requires a kind of internal consent, a willingness to let another person matter without immediately calculating the cost. The avoidant often loves without ever granting themselves that permission. The feeling arrives, but the authorization to act on it does not. This creates a strange internal experience, one where a person can genuinely love someone while simultaneously behaving as though they do not out of dishonesty, but out of an unresolved civil war between feeling and fear. There is a truth about vulnerability that almost nobody states clearly enough. Vulnerability is not the act of expressing emotion. Vulnerability is the willingness to remain present after that emotion has been expressed and possibly rejected. Many avoidants can access their feelings privately, in solitude where no risk exists. What becomes unbearable is standing inside those feelings while another person witnesses them, because witnessed emotion carries the possibility of judgment, misunderstanding, or abandonment. This is why an avoidant might write down what they feel, think it constantly, even grieve privately over a person they cannot seem to reach toward, yet still remain silent when given the chance to speak. Something must be said about the illusion of control because it explains far more of this dynamic than most people realize. Distance gives the avoidant a false sense of control over pain. If closeness is never fully allowed, then loss can never fully devastate. This logic feels protective on the surface, but it is built on a flawed premise because avoiding closeness does not prevent loss. It only guarantees a different kind of loss, the slow, quiet loss of never having experienced connection at its fullest depth. A person cannot lose what they never allowed themselves to have, but they also never gain the richness that comes from allowing it. The empath, meanwhile, often mistakes emotional access for emotional safety, and this mistake deserves closer examination. Being allowed to witness someone's pain is not the same as being wanted inside their life. Many empaths interpret an avoidant's occasional openness, a rare vulnerable text, a late-night confession, a moment of unguarded honesty, as proof of deep compatibility, when in reality these moments may simply be temporary lapses in defense rather than genuine invitations into intimacy. Confusing rare exceptions for consistent truth is one of the most common psychological traps in relationships defined by inconsistency. An uncomfortable but necessary observation must now be introduced. Some people unconsciously prefer relationships with avoidance because those relationships never demand full exposure of their own wounds either. Chasing someone emotionally unavailable can become a convenient distraction from doing one's own internal work. As long as attention remains focused on decoding another person's fear, there is no space left to examine personal patterns of self-worth, self-abandonment, or fear of true intimacy. In this way, both people may be unconsciously avoiding the same terrifying destination, complete emotional exposure, simply approaching that avoidance from opposite directions. Consider the psychological function of hope in these dynamics, because hope is rarely discussed as anything other than a virtue. Hope in unhealthy relational patterns can quietly transform into a coping mechanism that delays necessary action. Believing that change is coming, that the next conversation will finally break through, that consistency is just around the corner, can become a sophisticated form of self-deception, one that feels noble on the surface while slowly eroding self-respect underneath. Hope should inspire growth, not justify the prolonged tolerance of emotional starvation. A striking truth about identity emerges when examining why certain people remain loyal to emotionally unavailable partners far longer than logic would suggest. For some, staying becomes proof of their own capacity to love unconditionally, a badge of moral superiority worn quietly, almost sacredly. Leaving would mean admitting defeat, not just in the relationship, but in their internal narrative of being the kind of person who never gives up. This attachment to identity, rather than to the actual relationship, can trap someone far longer than genuine affection ever could, because ending the relationship would require ending a story they have told themselves about who they are. Now examine the avoidant's internal experience of being loved deeply by someone patient and consistent. Contrary to popular belief, this experience is not always comforting. For a nervous system unaccustomed to steady affection, consistency can feel foreign, even suspicious. Some avoidants unconsciously test unwavering love by pushing harder against it, not to destroy it, but to verify its authenticity. This creates a devastating irony, where the very people most capable of offering the stability an avoidant secretly craves are often met with the most resistance, precisely because that stability feels unfamiliar enough to trigger disbelief. At the deepest level of this exploration lies a truth about human suffering that transcends attachment theory entirely. Every person, regardless of their attachment pattern, is ultimately negotiating the same existential fear, the fear of being truly known and found insufficient. The avoidant manages this fear through distance. The empath manages this fear through relentless effort. Neither strategy resolves the fear. Both merely postpone the moment of true reckoning, the moment when a person must stand fully exposed, without performance, without protection, and discover whether they can accept themselves regardless of another person's response. This is where real transformation begins, not in changing someone else's capacity to love, but in confronting one's own capacity to remain whole without external validation. Stop waiting for someone else's fear to transform into courage on your behalf. That is not love. That is self-abandonment wearing the costume of patience. The avoidant may never fully open, and the empath may never fully stop hoping, unless both are willing to face the fear hiding beneath their own behavior instead of the behavior itself. Tonight, do one uncomfortable thing. Ask yourself honestly whether you are loving a person or clinging to a story about who you need to become in order to feel worthy. Write down the answer, even if it hurts. Growth does not begin when someone else changes. It begins the moment you stop needing them to. Love was never meant to be a test of endurance. It was meant to be a mirror. And the most important relationship you will ever heal is the one you have with the person staring back at you in that mirror.